Aloha students, how are we doing today? Hope everybody's hanging in there. We're getting close to the end here. Got just over a couple weeks left. So, like I said, I want to bring this course sort of full circle. I want to give you some, as much sort of content as I possibly can, and then we're going to do the final sort of project will be an easy comparison. We'll ask you a question about what's the most important event of world history that we study. Okay, so today I'm going to finish the discussion of the Conquistadors of Spain, and I'm going to take a look at the list of 14 things comparing Europeans to the Western Hemisphere and the differences of note. You're also watching some videos and reading some first-person accounts, accounts of the actual event between the Aztecs and the Spanish. Okay, all right, here we go. Let's continue. Today's topic is not about the Aztecs. This one is about the Incas and the contact between the Spanish and the Incas. Okay, so if you recall, if you get all the way back into this page, the Conquistadors of Spain, we went through all this stuff up here, and we got to, if you recall, we got to 2 columns. All right, and so I am going to talk about the second column today. And I'm going to talk about this guy Pizarro, and he is the one who was sort of featured in the video Guns, Germs, and Steel that you're watching. Guns, Germs, and Steel that you are watching. The Incas were found in Peru. So let me say something about. Let me just say a couple things about the Incas here before we sort of move on. The Incas were a massive, huge civilization in basically South America on the west coast. In today, what we would call Peru. Lima is the capital of Peru. Cuzco is a famous city. But really what most people, if they go to Peru, they go to see Inca ruins. And you should know that this is you may recall, and you certainly probably know what this place is. This is the famous city called Machu Picchu that is in the high mountains of Peru. So the entire length of the entire west coast of Peru is a mountain range called the Andes Mountains. And it's from the Andes Mountains, when the snow melts there towards the east, the water flows into the Amazon River. And this mountain range is sort of a continuation. The Rocky Mountains go from really Alaska and Canada all the way down through Colorado through North America. And the Andes is sort of a continuation, many people think, of this mountain range. And Machu Picchu was a lost city. The Spanish never knew it existed. It was refound by an American guy in 1911, a guy from Yale, and he discovered it was all grown over. And today it's one of the great tourist attractions of all of the world. Okay, so that's what you may know. I wanted to show you one other thing that sort of makes kind of a point here, is that when you live in the mountains, you've got a little bit of a problem. And that problem is agriculture. Because most of the time we think of agriculture in a flat field. Well, the Incas and their ancestors did not have such luck with that necessarily. And you probably, if you watched that video, Guns, Germs, and Steel, you probably saw some of these. This is what is called, ladies and gentlemen, this is called terrace farming. This is Inca agriculture right here, and I love this picture. This is one of my favorite pictures of this whole course because it makes a point of what I'm talking about on this whole thing. So if you look very carefully, you can see stone walls here built. You can't necessarily plant plants on a slope. So what did the Incas and their ancestors do? They built stairs into the side of the mountain. And so the point is obviously this is stone. And then this here, and it's not in this picture, and this is a photograph, it's not in modern times, but they would grow crops, okay? They would grow crops here. Where would the irrigation come from? The irrigation came from above the melted snow and ice, whereas most of the time we think of irrigation, it comes from below. It comes from the river below, and you need the river level to rise. In this case, the irrigation came from above. Now, just so you understand how big these are, take a look. This is the stairway where people walk up. Like, that's a person right there. Okay, so that's a human being. This is the human steps right here. So these agricultural steps are very challenging. And so my point is, agriculture in the Inca civilization and these South American civilizations on the west coast of South America were hard, because what do they have to do? This is a lot of labor intensive, isn't it? And so if people of the Incas, for example, are spending so much time on agriculture, just building it, what does that take away from? Well, I would argue, ladies and gentlemen, that takes away from specialized labor. Okay? All right. So let's continue with this discussion about the Incas, and I'll come back to a couple pictures here in a little bit. That, like I said, the Incas were in the mountains. Okay, they were. Well, there we go. They were in the mountains. Okay, and basically what happened was after the Spanish had conquered the Aztecs, they wanted to do it again as soon as possible, because the Spaniards managed to dig a lot of wealth out of central Mexico from the now fallen Aztec civilization. So the Spanish in the Caribbean Sea are like, oh, let's do it again. So they start to get rumors, they start to get reports of a big civilization further south. All right, and some people doubted it was possible that there was another. Some Spaniards said there's no way there's another big civilization like that. There's no way there's another Aztecs out there. There's no way. And so Pizarro, who was also like a military officer, he actually sailed all the way back to Spain and met with the King of Spain and convinced the King of Spain to let him lead an expedition down south to try to look for this second American civilization and see if they could conquer it. At this particular time, the Incas were 6 million strong. So this is a big civilization. It's long because it's mostly coast. It's on the coast and on the mountains, really sort of the frontal mountain range that coast along the coast of the Pacific, the South American west coast. All right. At this particular moment in time, the leader, and you sort of saw him portrayed in the video, Guns, Germs, and Steel. The leader of the Aztecs at this particular moment in time was a man named Atahualpa. And Atahualpa had just become king. He had just started his reign as king. He had just defeated his brother. That guy's name was Husakar. He had just defeated his brother in a civil war, basically. And that's how Atahualpa had become king. So he's a relatively young guy. He's probably in his late 20s when he becomes the king. All right. Now, the Incas remind me of the Romans. Remember I told you the Mayans remind me of the Greeks. They lived in city-states. They couldn't get together. They would attack each other. The Incas remind me of the Romans for two reasons. Number one is that the Incas were great road builders, just like the Romans were. The Romans built huge amounts of roads all throughout Europe through their time period. The Incas were great road builders. All right. The second thing that reminds me, that makes the Incas remind me of the Romans, is the fact that if you recall, the Romans would conquer a place, but eventually they would grant citizenship to the people of the place that they conquered. And in many cases, the conquered people came to realize that Roman rule was better than what they had beforehand, because the Romans would come in and they'd build roads and they'd build aqueducts and they'd build things like that, and things were better under Roman rule than their previous ruler. So citizenship is something that was very important to the Romans. So I see that with the Incas as well. The Incas would conquer groups of people, okay, and then they would let them become part of the Inca civilization, and they became part of the greater Inca civilization. But I should say, in both of these cases, the Aztecs and the Incas, they both had huge militaries and strong militaries, but they didn't really have rivals. And I'll just let you know that these two groups of people were not that far away from each other. Mexico to Peru, if you look on a modern map, is not that far. But neither knew of the other's existence. Neither one knew of the other's existence. Okay? So, therefore, Pizarro did not have, unlike Cortez, who used other Native Americans as allies, Pizarro had a lot smaller of a force, shall we say. Okay? And certainly his force was much smaller. He only had 177 men total. and he had some more horses. He had 62 horses altogether. So he has a little bit of different size. Okay, I talked to you yesterday, when you heard part one. I talked to you about how the Spaniards were very impressed by the bravery of the Aztecs and how Aztec warriors would fight one-on-one and try to capture you alive. Well, basically, the Incas never attacked because, really simply, Pizarro, and this is delved into in that video, Pizarro uses the playbook of Cortez. And the playbook said, what do you do to these Native American groups? What's the playbook? How do you solve this problem? Oh, you capture their leader. You grab that guy as soon as possible. Because, like I don't know if you recall me saying this the other day when I did this, I said, remember how I said there's no such thing as a dictator? Because nobody can operate, none of those dictators like Hitler operated in a vacuum all by himself. These two guys are as close in history as anybody that were true dictators. They weren't oligarchs. They were from a royal family, I'll grant you that, but they didn't have a big bunch of wealthy nobility or a group like that. Even their family members didn't help that much. They were singular. Okay, so when you captured these guys, there's complete chaos. In the United States, for example, like President Kennedy and President Lincoln are assassinated, we have a way that's set up in the United States that if the leader is taken out, we have a system set up right away. The vice president would take over. My point I'm trying to make here is that there's no such thing in the Inca civilization. There's no vice president king. How's that sound? So when these guys get captured here, there's chaos, and that's exactly what happened. Okay, and Atahualpa is held for ransom. He even suggested his ransom. He suggested he would fill a room full of gold and he would fill 2 rooms full of silver. And he pretty much did it, but the Spanish still put him to death. They still killed him. Okay? Now, Pizarro does something. Pizarro notices something as well when he arrives. And this is sort of interesting, and it's a little bit sort of sad, I suppose. But one of the things he noticed is that he saw that the smallpox virus had beat him to Peru. The smallpox, even though, like I said, the Aztecs and Incas didn't know of each other, smallpox had made its way from Mexico down to Peru faster than the Spanish. And remember now, let me give you a date here. Let me give you these dates here. That's an 11-year time period. Okay, so the smallpox epidemic moved quickly. Okay, so now I'm done with my 2. You can draw a line across here because I'm done with my 2 points that I'm trying to make. All right, so now let's make some general bullet points across here. There's a fact that we must take a look at here, and that is the fact that the Native American groups both had superior numbers at these particular events. These small events in relatively small time periods, in the Inca's case, less than a year, the Spanish are totally outnumbered. And really, if you take a look at this, both of these events, the Spanish should have been destroyed and decimated by these Native American forces strictly based on numbers. Yes, the difference in weapons is significant, but each one of these Native American tribes should have been able to still take losses but still be successful. And the Incas are even worse, because think about the terrain, the advantageous terrain that the Incas had that they did not use. They could have moved up the mountains. They could have picked off those 167 Spanish conquistadors literally one by one. But they were unable to figure that out. And really, both Montezuma and Atahualpa make major mistakes underestimating these new foes that have arrived from across the sea. Okay? All right, so let's continue here. What's the importance of this whole thing? Well, the fact of the matter is that when you look at the Western Hemisphere, you notice that from really the southern border of the United States, from the country of Mexico south, that entire region, Central and South America, is really dominated by Spanish culture. every one of those countries, with the exception of Brazil, they speak the Spanish language in those. That's their official language in those countries. Spanish culture is all over the southern hemisphere. There's also something else that we should recognize. Remember, don't forget, who else is being brought along? Who else is influencing these trips of the conquistadors? The Roman Catholic Church, and would say to the same thing. From really the southern border of the United States south, really that's the only religion in that area. That entire area, Central and South America, Roman Catholic. Okay? And look, let's be honest with each other. The Spanish find a lot of gold, and they take a lot of gold back with them, back to Spain. Every couple of years you hear a story of oh, they just found a sunken Spanish galleon in the Caribbean, and everybody's wondering, oh, maybe there's a bunch of gold that the thing went down with. Remember the Pirates of the Caribbean movie, the very first one? Do you remember that movie? What were they all looking for? They were looking for Aztec gold, if you recall. Okay? So Spain becomes extremely wealthy. They build more ships. They're the strongest nation in Europe. They're the wealthiest nation in Europe. And then what does that cause other... I mean, let's be... What are other European nations going to do? Here's where you have rivalry. Okay? What does England now say? What does Portugal say? What does France say? They all say, okay, we got to go to the Western Hemisphere. The Spanish are ahead of us. They're over there. We have to send our explorers over to the Western Hemisphere and claim land and try to find gold to strengthen ourselves. So this ramps up this competition, if you will, between European countries, this rivalry, if you will, between European countries to do what the Spanish did. And let's just finish this off. There's two big American civilizations that are out and out destroyed. And probably the two biggest and frankly the most military strong civilizations at that particular moment in history in the entire Western Hemisphere. If the Americas were going to be defended from invasion from the Eastern Hemisphere, if all of the Western Hemisphere peoples would have known each other, they would have picked the Aztecs and the Incas to put up a stand. But those two civilizations were, in retrospect, in comparison to Europeans, outmanned and outgunned even when they had superior numbers. And so these two civilizations are destroyed, and frankly, relatively quickly, you would have to say, by really much smaller size people. Okay? All right, now let's go back to this thing right here. Okay? And if you were, hopefully you started a piece of paper like this, you have a piece of paper going like this, and what I would say is I'm going to come back to this tomorrow, and this will be a short video that I will do tomorrow with you, and I'm just sort of saying, okay, what can you think of to sort of bring, and this is sort of one of the ways I'm trying to bring this course together to the end here, 14 things that you can sort of come up with that demonstrate a difference between the Spanish and the Europeans and the Aztecs, Incas, and other Native Americans. Okay? And really what I guess I could say is you could talk about the Eastern Hemisphere and the Western Hemisphere. Okay, so why don't we'll do, and there's 14, and I gave you a couple hints the other day. I said, think about just the actual events in this, like today we talked about the Spanish and the Incas. Can you think of a specific, at the event, that there was something different? And then your other hint was global. Do you recall that from the other day? Okay, so let's just do, why don't we just do one or two? I'll do two today, and I'll give you another hint while you're doing this. Okay, well I think probably one of the most obvious things was weapons. And what I would sort of say is what they brought was guns. Okay? And they brought cannons. All right, so the Spanish had that. Now, my point is, and we can get into what those, I would hint, what were those made out of? Okay, that's another one. What were the Native Americans, the Western Hemispherians, what were their weapons made out of? Well, they're made out of wood, okay, stone, bone, teeth, okay, things like that. And are their weapons impressive? Are they made with great craftsmanship? Well, I'll be honest with you, I would say yes. I would say absolutely they are. But what's the problem with them? They are not as deadly as guns are. Okay, so let me just sort of give you some examples here. These are Inca weapons. Let's just give you an example. Here's a couple of heads. One is on the top of this is a mace head, and this is like an axe, so you would put the piece of wood through there, okay? And then you could throw that, or it was handheld. A mace would be attached with a rope, okay? And you would swing this thing around and whack somebody with it, all right? Ever heard of bola balls? Okay, so bola balls are things you spin above your head and you throw them at something. They could take down a horse, actually. They could take a charge a horse down if you did it correctly. But they use slings. You'll notice the Incas did not have a bow and arrow. Okay, all right. So that's just some examples right there. Okay, now let's do another. Let me give you another hint. Okay, I gave you another hint just a moment ago, but I'll give you another one. What else did they bring with them? The Spanish brought horses. Okay, so now what? In this case, what are the horses used for? Well, horses in the Eastern Hemisphere and in Spain were used for war. Certainly, and you've probably seen lots of movies where the horses charge and all that kind of stuff, and horses were trained and easily trained to do all that kind of stuff. But let me throw this out at you as well. What else could horses be used for? What else could big game animals like this be used for? Well, they could be used for farming, for agriculture, which of course I love to discuss agriculture, don't I? And so my point is, what kind of big game animal did Native Americans have? Well, what kind of big game animals were there in the Americas? Well, the biggest animal that I could think of in the Americas was the buffalo of the North American plains. But those are not animals that you are able to domesticate easily. The horse is a relatively easy animal to domesticate. The cow is domesticatable. Sheep and goats are domesticatable. Okay, now sheep and goats are not good for war, but they can be used for their wool and things like that. So does this side have these things? Big game, domesticatable animals, and this is sort of why I would say over here, none. And my point, my key point here is big game. Okay, these got to be a horse, a cow, an ox. That's what I would sort of refer to as big game. Would you like to see the biggest animal that the Incas had? Here he is. Isn't he cute? Okay, that's a llama. Now, you're not going to see the Inca cavalry riding out of the mountains riding llamas into battle. That was not what llamas did. That's not what llamas were used for. You could not hook this animal up to a plow and this animal would plow a field like a horse could, or an oxen could, or even cows could be sometimes used for that. What is a llama used for? Well, a llama is really used for its milk, to a degree its meat, but mostly to its fur. And then I would also give you this one right here. This is an alpaca. Okay, but again, these are not animals used for war. These animals did not exist in the Western Hemisphere. Big game animals like horses did not exist in the Western Hemisphere. This is what did exist. All right, so this is a big difference. Okay, all right. So I'll give you. Why don't I give you two more? I'll give you two more hints. Okay, so each one of these would have something to do with one of these. So here's your hint. Number one, his name. Your hint is Christopher Columbus. So that's one hint for one of these. And then your next hint is Marco Polo. Okay? So those are your hints going forward. So why don't you see if you can fill this out before tomorrow. Try to fill this out. Remember, small of things like these things were at the Spanish brought guns and horses to the small event, the event between, for example, the Spanish and the Incas. Okay, your other hint, global. What can you know, what are some big things that were worldwide things that influenced that? All right, here's some hints that should be somewhere kind of in more in the middle, if you will. All right, so some hints for you. And I said some other things today. All righty, everybody. And then we'll do a short video tomorrow to sort of sew this baby up. We'll do this all together tomorrow. All right, everyone. I hope you enjoyed our discussion of the Spanish conquistadors and their contact with the very fascinating, Aztecs and Incas. That Native American culture in and of itself could be an entire course in and of itself. Okay? All right. I hope you enjoyed that, and I'll be looking forward to seeing you the next time. Have a great evening. Aloha.